For as long as nations have risen to prominence, there has been a recurring rhythm beneath the surface of global affairs, a rhythm that has led three separate superpowers over the past half millennium to expand, flourish, dominate, and then unravel. The sequence has repeated with such consistency that, looking backward, it resembles a script more than a series of accidents. Today, in 2025, the United States is tracing the contours of that exact pattern, step by familiar step, choice after choice, often with the same confidence, the same blindness, and the same illusion of permanence that characterized the empires that crumbled before it. When the pattern is laid out clearly, what becomes alarming is not how close the United States is coming to it, but how deeply it is already inside it. To appreciate how this mechanism operates, one must first understand what the end of a superpower actually looks like, not in historical summaries written a century later, but as it unfolds in real time. The death of an empire is rarely a loud, dramatic collapse in the moment it begins. It does not announce itself with invading armies or decisive defeats. Instead, it begins quietly, with strain, with overreach, with swelling obligations and shrinking means. It begins with a nation believing its influence, its wealth, its power, and its privilege are permanent fixtures of the world. It begins when a dominant power commits itself to maintaining global responsibilities that its economy cannot always support, and when it fills the widening gap between what it wants to be and what it can afford to be by borrowing, devaluing, or pretending. At first, nothing looks wrong. The currency still circulates. The military still projects force. The government still behaves like the guarantor of stability. Yet beneath these surface signs, the hinges begin to come undone. Spain, in the late 16th century, was the first to show how swiftly supremacy can mutate into fragility. After the voyages that linked Europe to the Americas, Spain found itself the master of incomprehensible wealth. Silver flowed into its ports in staggering quantities. The rulers of Spain believed themselves chosen by divine favor and by economic destiny, and they expanded their military presence accordingly, fighting on multiple fronts from North Africa to the Low Countries. Their empire stretched across oceans, fueled by shipments of precious metal that seemed inexhaustible. But the very abundance that made Spain powerful sowed the seeds of its decline. Possessing the world's monetary resources made Spain confident it could finance an unlimited number of commitments. It pushed deeper into Europe's battlefields, propped up allies, waged naval conflicts, supported crusades of religion and politics, all under the assumption that the mines would continue to yield infinite treasure. But the influx of easy money distorted everything. Instead of building a diversified economy, the Spanish elite convinced themselves that imported consumption was more dignified than domestic industry. Manufacturing shrank, farming stagnated, workers preferred patronage to productivity. The coinage was gradually degraded as the crown scrambled to stretch its silver further. Creditors who had once trusted the Spanish monarchy found themselves dealing with repeated defaults. The entire imperial machine was kept alive by the assumption that tomorrow shipments of bullion would always arrive. When they dwindled, Spain's might evaporated. Its armies weakened, its economy imploded, and its once unshakable currency became an embarrassment. The empire's decline was not the result of a single catastrophe, but of many years of exhausting its resources while failing to cultivate new ones. Several centuries later, Britain reached a similar point from a different direction. By the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire controlled such a vast share of the globe that its map appeared stained with its color. It administered territories on every inhabited continent, oversaw global trade routes, and issued the currency central banks everywhere trusted. London was the beating heart of finance, and the British elite assumed this would remain the case indefinitely. But maintaining garrisons, fleets, administrators, and supply lines over a quarter of the planet imposed enormous costs. Then came the First World War, which drained British wealth on an unprecedented scale. Instead of watching Europe tear itself apart from the sidelines, Britain plunged into the conflict, financing it with borrowed American money and with gold reserves that dwindled rapidly. When the war ended, victory concealed the economic wounds that would soon bleed the empire dry. Britain, unable to balance its commitments with its shrinking wealth, tried to restore the prestige of its currency by tying it again to gold at a rate that no longer matched reality. The result was predictable. Exports failed, factories idled, unemployment soared, and the country had to abandon the pretense of a strong pound. The currency fell. The empire followed. Within a generation, the territories that had once defined British dominance were becoming independent. The empire's global structure vanished so quickly that by the late 20th century, Britain was reduced to a mid-sized nation with symbolic remnants of its former status. What had taken centuries to build dissolved not through battlefield defeat, but through financial exhaustion, currency distortion, and the weight of obligations too heavy to carry. The Soviet Union presented the same story in a modern ideological form. After World War II, it stood as the only rival to the United States, commanding a vast military, controlling half of Europe, and developing nuclear capabilities that matched or surpassed anything the West possessed. Its leaders believed they could outlast and outproduce their capitalist opponents. But Soviet strength rested on a foundation of inefficiency. Resources were poured endlessly into the military, not because the economy could support it, but because the USSR needed to display parity with the United States in every arena. The burden of maintaining client states, from Cuba to Vietnam, imposed enormous costs, and the centrally planned economy stagnated. Output slowed, innovation died. Agriculture failed so badly that the Soviet Union, with its enormous landmass, had to buy grain abroad. The Soviet currency was a fiction. The ruble existed only by decree, not by trust. As global energy prices faltered, the USSR lost its last reliable source of revenue. The empire or its SI satellite states sensed the weakness and peeled off when Moscow could no longer compel obedience or sustain support. The collapse of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of a 900-day implosion, during which the Soviet Union dissolved into 15 separate nations. It was not military defeat, but economic exhaustion that destroyed it. The pattern repeated. Overextension, economic strain, currency breakdown, loss of influence, and finally collapse. All of this matters because the United States is now mirroring each stage with astonishing fidelity. Like Spain, it relies on a currency that the world treats as foundational. Like Britain, it has defended a global system for decades, assuming the costs are justified by the benefits. Like the Soviet Union, it spends staggering sums on military obligations that grow faster than the economy supporting them. The United States maintains an unparalleled network of bases, alliances, and commitments. It spends more on defense than numerous major nations combined, and yet its forces are stretched thin, its recruitment declining, and its obligations expanding. It is obligated to defend regions across the globe, Europe, East Asia, the Middle East, without pause or limitation. The assumption behind this posture is the same one Spain, Britain, and the USSR embraced. We can sustain this forever. Meanwhile, the American currency is undergoing a transformation just as destabilizing as the debasements of earlier powers, though accomplished with modern tools. The abandonment of the gold standard in the early 1970s allowed the United States to issue currency backed only by trust in its government and its economy. Over time, the temptation to create more money became irresistible. The supply expanded dramatically, especially in recent years, creating inflationary pressures and diminishing long-term confidence. At the same time, the national debt has soared to levels that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. The interest alone, now rivaling or exceeding major government programs, is a warning siren. This is the type of debt cycle that ensnared earlier empires. Borrowing to cover old borrowing, deficit spending during times of peace, and political paralysis preventing meaningful reform. Beyond that, the United States faces the same erosion of domestic production that crippled Spain and Britain. Factories have closed or relocated offshore. Supply chains depend on distant nations. An enormous portion of essential goods, from pharmaceuticals to electronics, comes from abroad. As dollars proliferate and flow outward, America becomes more dependent on imports. When an empire no longer produces what it consumes, it becomes vulnerable. The belief that the dollar's status will protect the nation indefinitely is a dangerous assumption. Reserve currency privilege can mask structural weaknesses for a long time, but not forever. Social fragmentation forms another part of the pattern. When trust collapses, when institutions lose legitimacy, when societal cohesion dissolves, an empire enters the stage where the internal rot becomes as threatening as any external competitor. The United States is experiencing this in visible, undeniable ways. Political animosity has escalated beyond disagreement into mutual disbelief. Crime, addiction, homelessness, and mental health crises spread through many cities. People lose faith in government, in media, in business, in one another. Fertility rates fall. Innovation stagnates under bureaucracy and polarization. The symptoms mirror those seen in late-stage empires. Internal weakening that makes external threats more dangerous. If earlier superpowers provide a map, then the next two stages, loss of reserve currency status and rapid contraction, are not hypothetical. They are historically consistent outcomes once the preceding conditions are met. Nations around the world are already experimenting with alternatives to the dollar. Major economies are trading in other currencies. Central banks are stockpiling gold. What once seemed unthinkable, the decline of the dollar's dominance, is now discussed openly in global economic forums. With the world holding mountains of U.S. debt and dollars, a shift away from reliance would send those dollars back into the American economy, triggering inflation, currency shock, and financial instability. This is how reserve currencies fall, gradually at first, then abruptly. Should that happen, the final stage arrives quickly. Debt servicing becomes impossible. Military presence contracts. Domestic crises intensify. Allies hedge their bets or realign with emerging powers. The superpower finds itself no longer at the center of global finance or diplomacy. It becomes one country among many, not the anchor of the world order, but a participant in a new one shaped by others. Past empires experienced this not as slow fades, but as sudden plunges. The Soviet Union disappeared in mere years. Britain relinquished its empire within a generation. Spain watched its influence evaporate across a century. But the decisive breaks came swiftly and were irreversible. The troubling truth is that the United States has already passed the first 5 phases of this historical cycle. Overextension, established. Currency debasement, evident. Debt spiral, ongoing. Erosion of domestic production, documented. Social deterioration, visible daily. That leaves 2 stages remaining: loss of reserve currency status and eventual collapse. The speed is uncertain, but the trajectory is unmistakable. The belief that America is so exceptional it can escape the laws of economic gravity is the same belief every previous empire held. They were proven wrong. We may be as well. Perhaps the country can pull itself back from the brink. Reform, renewal, and reinvention are possible. Nations have reversed declines before, though not often at this scale. Perhaps technology, ingenuity, or unexpected leadership could alter the path. Perhaps this time will diverge from history. But the pattern, traced across centuries, does not offer comforting predictions. It is mathematical in its logic, unforgiving in its sequence, and indifferent to national myths. If one understands the past, one can anticipate the future. The story unfolding now is not new. It is ancient, familiar, and deeply human. The United States stands at a moment where the past is whispering warnings, showing outlines of what is to come. If the pattern continues, the stages ahead will arrive faster than most expect, reshaping the world overnight. And when that moment comes, people will look back at this era and realize the clues were everywhere.